Assalamualaikum everybody and welcome back to our show on what case are we reviewing today. So for today we have the case of Siew Ying trading as full Lin Bat Grafting Center and Gunung Tunggal Quarry and Construction Sendirian Berhad and another 2011. So without further ado, let us move on to the material facts segment.
This is the plaintiff. The plaintiff owns a lot of land which he plans to turn into a plant nursery. And this is the second defendant. Second defendant owns a land adjoining with the plaintiff land. And in that land, there is a natural limestone hill. And this is the first defendant, who is a quarry operator. The second defendant then leased the land to the first defendant. The third defendant had issued a license for the first and second defendant to move the materials from the land. And on 29 December 1987, there was a heavy rain in the area which caused a large slice of hill atop the second defendant land to collapse and hit the plaintiff land. And here is a shown footage of the plaintiff claiming for negligence against the first, second and third defendant.
Right, we have finished the material facts segment. So now for your guys' information, the principles of law in this case is when there is overlapping factors that cause injury to the plaintiff, the but-for test could not be applied, but rather the test in Bonington Casting Limited and what law is applied, whether the defendant acts materially contribute to the harm occurred to the plaintiff. So now, without further ado, let us move on to the legal analysis segment.
Assalamualaikum brothers.
Waalaikumsalam.
What you guys doing?
We currently discussing about this case. Siew Ying trading as Foh Lin Bat Grafting Center and Gunung Tunggal Quarry and Construction Sdn Bhd and another 2011.
Oh, I know that case. May I join you?
Yeah, sure, come.
So, if you would like to know, there are a few parties to the case. The first one is the plaintiff, namely Siew Ying, who is operating under the Foh Lin Bat Grafting Center, the owner of a plant nursery damaged by a limestone collapse. The second one is the first defendant. The first defendant is the Gunung Tunggal Quarry and Construction Sdn Bhd and the quarry operator responsible for blasting operation on the adjacent hill. The third party that was involved in this case is the second defendant, namely Darus bin Muhammad Said, the registered owner of the land leased to the first defendant for quarrying operation. And the last parties to this case is the third defendant, the Director of Land and Mines, Perak, who issued the license for quarrying.
Oh, it's not this the case that have four main legal issue.
Yes, that's correct.
The first main legal issue is, did the first defendant owe a duty of care to the plaintiff? And the second main legal issue is, if so, did the first defendant breach the duty of care? Okay, so the third legal issue is, did the quarrying operation materially contribute to the hill collapse, thereby satisfying the causation in law and causation in fact? And the last legal issue is the second defendant vicariously liable for the act of the first defendant as an independent contractor? So that are the four main legal issues in this case.
So I see that this case is under negligence, which is the conduct falling below the standard demanded for the protection of others against any unreasonable risk of harm. So to prove or to win negligent case, we must prove three elements, which is the first one is duty of care, which is under the duty of care we have another key element, namely possibility of harm, proximity of relationship, and is it just, fair or reasonable to impose that duty. So the first element of duty of care, we need to prove there is possibility of the harm. So what is mean by that? By that possibility is it the harm or the damage can be foreseeable by the defendant. So for this case, we can actually see that the defendant can actually foresee that the this activity of quarrying at that limestone hill will cause or will cause damage to the limestone hill and further causing damage to the surrounding area when the limestone hill collapse. So for the second element, the proximity of relationship, we can actually see that is there any closeness of the relationship between the plaintiff and the defendant. What is mean by the closeness is not just beside of the plaintiff, it's just about whether the action of the defendant can directly affected plaintiff. So in this case, we can see that the plaintiff and defendant, they both have lands, adjoining land between each other, and then when defendant do something in his land, it can directly affect it to the plaintiff land. So lastly, is it fair, just and reasonable to impose the duty to the defendant, or is it can be something that is burden to defendant, or is it can happen to disrupt the operation of law in our society? So in this case, we can see that the activity of the defendant is a high risk activity, which he should have taken preventive measures or any extra precautionary measures to prevent any harm or damage that may cause to the people surrounding him. But I'm not sure about the second element. Can you explain more?
Right, so basically the second element of negligence is the breach of duty of care. And under this element, there are one test that needs to be tested before establishing these elements, and the name of the test is the concept of a reasonable man test. So what is basically the concept of a reasonable man test? This test is to test whether the defendant's conduct fell below the standard of care, which is to be expected by a reasonable man. And under this test, there are 5 sub-elements that needs to be established. And the first one is the foreseeability of harm. Second one is the magnitude of risk. Third one is the importance of the defendant's purpose. The fourth one is the practicability of precaution. And the last one is the general and approved practice. So the first sub-element under the elements of breach of duty of care is the foreseeability of harm. So in this case, the first defendant knew or should have known about the risk of rockfalls from the blasting vibrations, particularly given the geological nature of the limestone hill and the nursery proximity. Right, so the second sub-element of this test is the magnitude of risk. So, in this case, the risk of significant damage to the plaintiff's property was substantial. The collapse would cause irreparable harm to the nursery operation, as demonstrated by the aftermath of the hill collapse. Right, so the third sub-element is the importance of the defendant's purpose. However, the purpose of the third sub-element is not relevant to be discussed in this case. So we are going to skip to the fourth sub-element of this test. So the fourth sub-element that needs to be established is the practicability of the precaution. So, reasonable precautions such as using the proper blasting technique, securing the hill stability were available and could have mitigated the risk of the collapse. Evidence also showed a lack of proper safety measures such as drainage system and monitoring the hill structural integrity. The last sub-element that needs to be established is the general and approved practice. So, in this case, the first defendant had failed to demonstrate the adherence to industry standards or general safety practices for quarrying operations. Testimony also highlighted that blasting operations were conducted without sufficient regard to the structural weaknesses of the hill. So, if I'm not mistaken, the next elements to be established in negligence is causation, and I'm not pretty sure about what to say about causation. Can you explain more about that?
Yeah, I really understand what is causation. So basically, you need to know that we have 2 causation, which first causation in law and causation in fact. However, in this case, we only focus in causation in fact. So maybe both of you do not know what is causation in fact. So causation in fact is a matter of fact that the damage suffered by the plaintiff was caused by the defendant. It is important to determine that the defendant's action directly caused harm to the plaintiff. In this case, the application of but-for test cannot be applied. So, what is but-for test? But-for test is a common test used to determine whether the damage would not have occurred but for the negligence of the defendant. So, why it cannot be applied? Because in this case, there is multiple contributing factors such as heavy rainfall and quarry vibration, which lead to the collapse of the hill.
Oh, okay. So from here, actually I can conclude that the duty of care was actually established because of due to the proximity of the harm, the proximity of the relationship, and also it's just fair and reasonable to impose the duty. And also there is a breach because of the proximity, the harm can be foreseeable, and then the magnitude of the risk is very high, and then the precaution taken by the defendant actually is not practical, and lastly the defendant does not follow the general and approved practice of the other player. And lastly, about the causation, I see that the High Court in the previous case, they actually applied explicitly the but-for test, but in this appeal, in this federal court case, they apply the material contributing factors rather than the but-for test. About the second defendant, which is the landowner of the land, the federal court dismissed the appeal because they are not the second defendant and the first defendant are not directly in relationship between each of them. Okay, now wrap it up on the legal analysis. We will move to the next section, which is judgment of the case. So in this case, the appeal is allowed against the first defendant. The first defendant was found liable under negligence. Damages must be paid by the first defendant to the plaintiff. But appeal against the second defendant is dismissed. The decision by High Court and Court of Appeal is set aside in favour of the plaintiff. The exclusive use of but-for test is rejected due to the presence of multiple contributing factors in the case. That's all for today. Thank you for tuning in.